In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says, "We proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, Jew and Greek alike, Christ is the very power of God and the very wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than any human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than any human strength." This is Holy Week. This week, millions of Christians throughout the world will be celebrating, will be proclaiming Christ crucified. Christ crucified will be at the center of their celebrations, the center of their worship services. In fact, Christ crucified is the very heart and soul of their faith, the very heart and soul of Christianity itself. But for many non-Christians, Christ crucified is utter foolishness, even offensive. For many non-Christians, Christ crucified is a major stumbling block to them seeing Christianity as being in any way rational. Sam Harris is one of the most insightful critics of Christianity. In his book, Letter to a Christian Nation, this is what he says about Christ crucified. The notion that Jesus Christ died for our sins and that his death constitutes a successful propitiation of a quote-unquote loving God is a direct and undisguised inheritance of the superstitious bloodletting that has plagued bewildered people throughout history. Strong words. He goes on to say this: Christianity amounts to the claim that we must love and be loved by a God who approves of the scapegoating, torture, and murder of one man, incidentally, his son, in compensation for the misbehavior and thought crimes of all others. On the surface, I couldn't agree more. On the surface, I couldn't agree more with what Harris is saying there about the utter absurdity, even offensiveness of the cross. But over the years, what I've found is that when you go beneath the surface, when you dig deeper, the cross starts to make a whole lot more sense than we think. In fact, it turns out that the cross is the only way that a loving God could love a fallen creation and then reconcile sinners like ourselves back to himself. I'll break down how that begins to make sense in the future. But still, even so, even though that's true, Harris is onto something. He's right about one thing. At some level, the cross will always remain an absurdity to us. It will always appear to be an offense or to appear to be utter weakness to us. But that's not an argument against the cross. In fact, it provides a profound reason to believe in it. Here's why. If the cross is what it claims to be, if the cross is doing what Christians say it's actually doing, which is reconciling the perfect justice and perfect mercy of God within himself, then it's operating at the transcendent level, beyond space and time, in infinity, within the divine nature, at the level of the divine nature. Of course, it's happening all in what's called an eternal moment. I won't go into what all that means, but just briefly, what it's saying is that even though it's a point in history, a point in time where Jesus dies on the cross, it is something that has affected God throughout all eternity. In other words, God doesn't change at the cross. There's no change in God. It's something that God, throughout all eternity, foresaw in creating us, that he would need to do this, and so had reconciled through eternity his perfect justice and perfect mercy. But if that's what the cross is doing, if the cross is actually something that's taking place within the infinite God, then mere mortals like us, finite human beings like us, shouldn't expect to be able to understand it, to comprehend it. We should expect that it would actually look like an absurdity, look like foolishness, look like weakness, look like an offense to us. In fact, if we could understand it, if we could grasp it simply, if we could just get it in a couple of seconds, then we should suspect it's not doing the thing that it claims to be doing. We should suspect that it is not reconciling us to the eternal God. Hate the sin, but love the sinner. You probably heard that phrase 100 times. When we say that, hate the sin, love the sinner, what we usually mean by that, that's kind of a shorthand, a simplistic way that we can talk about balancing these ideas of justice and mercy, of reconciling, being fair, but also being forgiving towards somebody who's really messed up. It sounds so simple, right? But it's not. It gets really complicated really quickly. Just think, for example, about the gunmen involved in the 2 mass shootings this past week or week and a half or so, the one in Atlanta and then Colorado. How do you love the sinner? How do you apply this? Love the sinner but hate the sin. How do you apply this to those gunmen? I mean, to hate their sin, to detest their sin, to do justice would mean to make them experience the same kind of pain that they've inflicted on their victims. Somehow, I don't know how you would do that, but to somehow have them experience the same pain that they caused by taking the lives of all the people that they killed, and then all the suffering they inflicted on their loved ones who are grieving and heartbroken now. But to love them, to love the sinner, to be merciful to them, means to release them from the consequences of their sin, to release them from what they so justly deserve, which would be an incredible slight to their victims. See, from God's perspective, God can't be just if he simply forgives us and then doesn't somehow do justice by those people that we've offended. Conversely, it wouldn't be fair to us if God forgave the people who offended us without somehow doing justice toward us. I mean, think about the person who in your life has offended you the most, has hurt you the most in your life. Imagine if God just came along and said that he was going to freely forgive them, but didn't deal with the way that they hurt you, didn't deal with the consequences of their actions, didn't do justice by you. Then God would no longer be just, let alone perfectly just. So how is it, if we have so much trouble understanding how to balance justice and mercy on a finite plane, how is it that God is supposed to reconcile his perfect justice and perfect mercy? How is he supposed to love the sinner but hate the sin? Well, the Christian answer to that is the cross. And when all is said and done, the absurdity, the foolishness, the offense, the weakness of the cross is exactly what we should expect, that it would appear to us that way, is exactly what we should expect if Jesus' death on the cross is actually satisfying somehow God's perfect justice and perfect mercy. I mean, it is, after all, God who is dying on that cross. It is, after all, God who is taking on all the suffering that all our sin has caused throughout all time in order that he might detest our sin with a passion, hate our sin with a passion, but at the same time that he might love us sinners with an even greater passion. Christ crucified must appear absurd to us because it's the otherworldly wisdom and power of God. And as we'd expect, God's foolishness is wiser, infinitely wiser than any human wisdom. God's weakness is infinitely more powerful than any human power. I pray that you will have the most awesome Holy Week this year, contemplating this otherworldly love of a God who would give his life on the cross for us.